Elon Musk saves boy from danger. What happens next is unreal. The air was electric with excitement as families gathered near the towering rocket, its sleek surface gleaming under the late afternoon sun. The event, hosted by one of the world's leading space exploration companies, had drawn a large crowd of enthusiasts, parents, and children eager to witness the next step in humanity's journey to the stars. The open field near the launch site buzzed with energy. Children in miniature flight suits darted between the adults, their laughter rising above the hum of voices. Booths lined the perimeter, offering everything from space-themed snacks to virtual reality experiences of walking on Mars. It was a celebration of ambition, innovation, and the limitless possibilities of the future. In the middle of the crowd stood a boy no older than 10, his bright eyes wide with wonder as he stared up at the rocket. His name was Ethan, and from the moment his father had told him they were coming to this event, he hadn't been able to think of anything else. Space had always fascinated him, the idea of soaring through the stars, exploring the unknown. He dreamed of being an astronaut someday, of being the first to set foot on planets no one had ever seen. "Stay close, Ethan," his father called out, his voice barely audible over the crowd. He was busy flipping through the event schedule on his phone, trying to figure out the next presentation. "I don't want you wandering off. I'm right here," Ethan called back, though his attention was still locked on the rocket. It was the most incredible thing he'd ever seen, and he couldn't help but inch closer, weaving through the crowd to get a better look. A few feet away, two men stood near one of the food stalls, their expressions tense and their voices low. They didn't fit in with the cheerful atmosphere around them. Their dark clothing and sharp movements made them stand out like shadows against the bright, festive backdrop. One of them glanced toward the rocket, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd. "You sure about this?" one of the men asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Positive," the other replied, his tone clipped. "The timing's perfect. No one will see it coming." Ethan, oblivious to the men and their hushed conversation, had managed to make his way to the front of the crowd. He stood at the edge of the barricade that separated the audience from the restricted area around the rocket, his small hands gripping the metal railing. He stared up at the massive structure, his heart racing with excitement. He wished he could get closer, to touch it, to feel the cool surface of the metal that would one day travel beyond Earth's atmosphere. Behind him, his father looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing when he didn't immediately see Ethan. "Ethan," he called, his voice rising with concern. He scanned the crowd, his heart skipping a beat when he realized his son was no longer by his side. Meanwhile, the two men had begun to move. Their pace was measured but purposeful, their eyes fixed on the restricted area near the rocket. One of them carried a small black case, his grip firm as they slipped through a gap in the fencing, unnoticed by the busy crowd. They moved quickly, their expressions grim as they disappeared into the shadows near the base of the rocket. Ethan didn't notice his father calling for him. He was too engrossed in the scene before him, the towering rocket filling his field of vision. But something else caught his eye, a figure moving near the rocket's base, where no one was supposed to be. He squinted, his curiosity piqued as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Hey kid," a voice said, startling him. Ethan turned to see a man in a sleek blue jumpsuit standing nearby, a lanyard with an official badge hanging around his neck. His face was friendly, his smile warm as he crouched to Ethan's level. "You like rockets?" Ethan nodded eagerly, his excitement momentarily overriding his confusion. "They're amazing. I want to be an astronaut when I grow up." The man chuckled, his eyes glancing toward the rocket. "It's a good dream," he said, "but you've got to be careful. This is a big event, and it's easy to get lost. Where's your dad?" Ethan hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the sea of people behind him. He didn't see his father anywhere. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice small. "He was right behind me." The man's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Tell you what," he said, rising to his feet. "Why don't we get you back to your dad? Events like this can get a little overwhelming." Ethan nodded, his trust in the man immediate and absolute. But as they turned to head back into the crowd, The man stopped abruptly, his expression shifting. His eyes locked on something in the distance, his body tensing as though he just realized something was terribly wrong. Ethan followed his gaze, his stomach twisting when he saw the two men from earlier. They were near the base of the rocket now, their movements hurried and suspicious. One of them opened the black case, pulling out what looked like a tangle of wires and small devices. "What are they doing?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his hand moving to the earpiece clipped to his lanyard. "We've got a situation near the launch pad," he said quietly, his tone urgent. "Two unauthorized individuals. Looks like they're setting up." He stopped, his eyes widening as he realized what the devices were. Explosives! Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Explosives? His mind raced, struggling to comprehend the danger he was suddenly in the middle of. He looked up at the man, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do we do?" The man didn't respond immediately. He scanned the crowd, his eyes darting from face to face before finally landing on someone who stood out. Not because of how he looked, but because of how he carried himself. Elon Musk was moving through the crowd, his expression focused, his every step deliberate. The man raised a hand, signaling to Elon. "Over here," he called, his voice cutting through the noise. Elon turned, his eyes locking onto the man and the frightened boy at his side. His pace quickened, his expression shifting to one of quiet determination as he closed the distance between them. Ethan stared up at Elon, his fear momentarily forgotten, as he recognized the man from interviews and news stories. "You're him," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Elon crouched down, his gaze steady and reassuring as he looked Ethan in the eye. "I am," he said simply, "and we're gonna fix this. But first, I need you to be brave." The air around the launch site grew heavy, as if the excitement of moments earlier had been sucked out and replaced with an uneasy tension. Elon remained crouched in front of Ethan, his calm demeanor steadying the boy despite the chaos unfolding around them. The two men near the rocket's base worked quickly, their movements efficient and deliberate, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that their actions were beginning to draw attention. "Elon," the man in the blue jumpsuit said, his voice low but urgent. "They've got some kind of device, explosives, from what I can tell. Security spread thin across the event, and the nearest team is tied up near the main stage." Elon nodded, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "Stay calm," he said, his voice soft yet commanding. "We're going to handle this." Ethan nodded, though his small hands gripped the edge of his jacket tightly. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, his fear almost overwhelming. But something in Elon's tone, his unshakable confidence, made Ethan believe him. Even in the face of danger, Elon seemed completely in control. Elon straightened, his gaze shifting to the two men near the rocket. They were still working, oblivious to the growing unease in the crowd. He could see one of them holding a small device, his hands moving deftly as he connected wires. The other man glanced around, his sharp eyes scanning the area for any signs of interference. Elon's jaw tightened. Whoever these men were, they knew what they were doing. They weren't amateurs, and that made them all the more dangerous. "We need to get the crowd back," Elon said, his voice firm, quietly without causing a panic. "If they realize we're onto them, they might speed up whatever they're planning." The man in the blue jumpsuit nodded. "I'll coordinate with event staff and get security to start clearing people out." Elon glanced at Ethan, who was still standing close to his side. "And he needs to be somewhere safe," he added, his voice softening slightly. "Find his father and get them both out of here." Ethan's eyes widened, and he shook his head quickly. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "I want to stay. I can help." Elon crouched again, his gaze steady and reassuring. "You've already helped," he said gently. "But the best way you can help now is by staying safe. Can you do that for me?" Ethan hesitated, his small hands clenching into fists. He didn't want to leave. He didn't want to feel like he was running away. But the way Elon looked at him, the calm certainty in his voice, made him nod reluctantly. "Okay," he whispered. The man in the blue jumpsuit placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, guiding him toward the crowd. "Come on, kid. Let's get you back to your dad." Elon watched them go, his gaze lingering on Ethan for a moment before returning to the scene near the rocket. He took a deep breath, his mind already racing through possible scenarios. The two men were too far away to confront directly without being noticed, and there was no telling how volatile their devices might be. Every second mattered, but rushing in blindly wasn't an option. He turned toward the nearby barricade, where a group of event staff had gathered, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. "We need to clear this area," Elon said, his voice carrying authority. "Get everyone behind the outer perimeter. Now!" The staff hesitated, their eyes darting between Elon and the rocket. "What's going on?" one of them asked nervously. "Is there a problem?" Elon's gaze hardened. "There's a potential threat," he said bluntly. "We don't have time for explanations. Just move the crowd back." The urgency in his tone spurred them into action. They began directing the crowd away from the barricade, their voices calm but firm as they urged people to step back. The murmurs of confusion grew louder, but most of the attendees complied, moving away from the rocket with cautious curiosity. Ethan's father appeared in the throng, his face pale with worry as he scanned the crowd. When he spotted Ethan, relief flooded his expression. He rushed forward, pulling his son into a tight hug. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Ethan clung to his father, his small hands clutching the back of his jacket. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I just wanted to see the rocket up close." His father exhaled shakily, holding him close. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." But as he glanced toward the rocket and the activity near the barricade, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on?" he asked, looking at the man in the blue jumpsuit. "There's a situation," the man replied, his voice low. "You need to stay back." Meanwhile, Elon had positioned himself closer to the restricted area, his sharp eyes fixed on the two men. They were still working, their movements hurried now, as though they could sense the growing unease in the crowd. One of them glanced over his shoulder, his expression tense as he noticed the barricade being pushed farther back. "Someone's onto us," he muttered to his companion. "Doesn't matter," the other replied, his tone clipped. "We're almost done. Just keep going." Elon's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't know who these men were or what their motives might be, but he couldn't let them finish what they'd started. The rocket wasn't just a symbol of innovation. It represented hope, progress, and the future, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as people began to realize something was wrong. Parents pulled their children closer, and attendees exchanged worried glances. The festive atmosphere had all but evaporated, replaced by a tension that hung heavy in the air. Ethan, still holding tightly to his father's hand, looked back toward the rocket. His heart ached with a mix of fear and guilt. He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was serious, that it was bigger than anything he'd ever been a part of. And as he watched Elon step closer to the restricted area, his expression one of quiet determination, Ethan whispered under his breath, "Be careful." The tension in the air was palpable now, the once cheerful murmurs of the crowd replaced by uneasy whispers. The makeshift barricades erected by event staff did little to quell the growing anxiety rippling through the attendees. Parents held their children close, their eyes darting nervously toward the towering rocket and the figures moving suspiciously near its base. It was clear to anyone paying attention that something was very wrong. Elon Musk stood at the edge of the restricted area, his calm demeanor masking the storm of calculations running through his mind. He could see the two men clearly now, their faces set in grim determination as they worked with a cluster of devices. One of them crouched low, fiddling with a small box bristling with wires and blinking lights. The other stood watch, his sharp gaze scanning the thinning crowd. Elon's hands curled into fists. He wasn't a man prone to panic, but the stakes were unmistakable. The men's movements were too precise, their focus too intense for this to be anything other than what he feared. A deliberate attempt to sabotage the event, or worse. He had no way of knowing what their endgame was, but he couldn't afford to wait and find out. Behind him, the man in the blue jumpsuit reappeared, his face tight with urgency. "Security's on their way," he said, his voice low, "but they're spread thin. It'll be a few more minutes before they can get here." Elon didn't look away from the men. "We don't have a few minutes," he said, his tone clipped. "If those devices are what I think they are, we're out of time." The man hesitated, glancing toward the rocket. "You're not seriously thinking about going over there, are you?" Elon turned to him, his expression hard. "What would you suggest? Waiting until they finish whatever they're doing? Letting them dictate the outcome?" The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. There was something about Elon's presence, his unshakable resolve, that made it impossible to challenge him. He gave a short nod. "What do you need?" "Keep the crowd back," Elon said, "and make sure no one crosses that barricade. The last thing we need is more people in harm's way." The man nodded again, his steps brisk as he moved to relay the instructions to the event staff. Elon turned his attention back to the restricted area, his mind racing. The two men were so focused on their task that they hadn't noticed him yet. But that wouldn't last. He needed to act quickly and carefully. He moved toward the barricade, his steps deliberate. He didn't hesitate as he slipped through a gap in the fencing, his sharp eyes locked on the two men. They were still engrossed in their work, their hands moving quickly as they connected wires and adjusted settings on the devices. Elon crouched low, keeping his movements quiet as he closed the distance between them. From his vantage point, he could see the setup more clearly now. The box bristling with wires was unmistakably a bomb, not large enough to destroy the rocket itself, but certainly capable of causing significant damage. The placement was deliberate, designed to maximize impact without drawing attention until it was too late. Elon's jaw clenched. These men weren't just reckless, they were calculated. Whoever they were, they knew exactly what they were doing. The man standing guard suddenly glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he spotted movement. His hand darted to his hip, and Elon caught the glint of metal, a gun. His heart pounded, but he didn't slow his approach. If they saw him as a threat, it might give him the opportunity he needed to disrupt their plan. "What was that?" the guard asked, his voice sharp. The other man didn't look up from his work. "Probably just some idiot security guy. Keep an eye out, but don't stop. We're almost done." Elon stepped into the open, his posture relaxed but his expression steely. "I wouldn't finish that if I were you," he said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to make both men freeze. The guard turned fully, his gun now visible, though he hadn't raised it yet. His eyes narrowed as he took in Elon's unassuming appearance. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Someone who doesn't want to see this day end in disaster," Elon replied evenly. He took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if daring them to act. "But if you're as smart as you think you are, you'll stop now and walk away." The man crouching by the device finally looked up, his face twisting into a sneer. "Walk away," he repeated, his tone mocking. "Do you even know what's going on here?" "I know enough," Elon said. "And I know that whatever point you're trying to make isn't worth the lives you're putting at risk." The guard's grip on the gun tightened, but he still didn't raise it. "This isn't about lives," he said, his voice low. "It's about sending a message." Elon's gaze didn't waver. "A message no one will listen to if it comes at the cost of innocent people." The man crouching by the device let out a harsh laugh. "You think we care about innocent people? You think any of this matters to us?" "It will," Elon said quietly, "when you're the ones paying the price for it." The two men exchanged a glance, a flicker of uncertainty passing between them. They hadn't expected this. A lone man standing in their way, unarmed but unshaken. They had planned for security, for chaos, for a rushed evacuation. But this was different. This was unexpected. The guard took a step forward, his gun now fully visible, though still pointed downward. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But guts don't mean anything when you're outnumbered." Elon's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched." The man crouching by the device hesitated, his hands hovering over the wires. "What's your play here?" "Huh?" he asked, his tone tinged with irritation. "You think you can stop us?" "I think you've already stopped yourselves," Elon replied. "Because you're standing here arguing with me instead of finishing what you started." The guard's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. He glanced toward the crowd, which had pushed farther back but was still watching intently. The pressure was building, the cracks in their plan widening with every passing second. Elon took another step forward, his calm demeanor unnerving them both. "The longer this drags on, the more likely it is you'll be caught," he said. "Walk away now, and maybe you'll still have a chance to salvage whatever you think you're fighting for." The crouching man's hands trembled, his resolve wavering. The guard cursed under his breath, his gun shifting slightly as his focus split between Elon and the crowd. And in that moment, Elon knew he had them. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last as Elon stood his ground. His gaze locked on the two men. The tension was palpable, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. The guard's hand twitched on his weapon, his knuckles white from the force of his grip. His companion crouched near the device, his hands hovering over the wires as uncertainty flickered across his face. The crowd behind the barricade was restless now, their murmurs growing louder as they watched the standoff unfold. Parents pulled their children closer, their expressions a mixture of confusion and fear. Event staff whispered urgently among themselves, their eyes darting between Elon and the rocket. "You're making a mistake," Elon said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. He took a deliberate step forward, his presence commanding despite the obvious danger. "Whatever point you're trying to make, this isn't the way." The crouching man let out a harsh laugh, though it lacked conviction. "You don't get it, do you?" he muttered, his voice shaking slightly. "This isn't about making a point. It's about showing them what happens when they ignore us." Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "And who exactly are they?" he asked. "Because from where I'm standing, all I see are two men risking everything for nothing." The guard's jaw tightened, his frustration evident as he glanced toward the crowd. "We're not risking everything," he snapped. "We're making a statement." Elon's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "A statement that ends with you in handcuffs or worse. Is that really how you want this to go?" The guard hesitated, his grip on the gun faltering for the briefest moment. His companion shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling as he reached for the wires. The cracks in their resolve were beginning to show, but the danger was far from over. "Enough," the crouching man muttered, his voice low but sharp. He looked up at the guard, his expression hardening. "We finish this. Now." Elon's heart pounded in his chest, but his composure didn't waver. He took another step forward, his every movement calculated. "Think about what you're doing," he said, his tone steady. "You're standing at the edge of a cliff. One more step, and there's no turning back." The guard's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he didn't lower the gun. "You don't scare us," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I'm not trying to scare you," Elon replied. "I'm trying to stop you from making a mistake you can't take back." The crouching man let out another laugh, this one more bitter. "And why do you care?" he asked, his hands still hovering over the wires. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Elon's expression softened ever so slightly. "I care because I know what it's like to stand where you are," he said quietly. "To feel like the world is against you, like no one's listening. But this isn't the way to fix it." The man froze, his hands trembling as he stared at Elon. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something vulnerable, something human. But the moment passed, and his expression hardened once more. "Nice speech," he muttered. "But it's too late for that." The guard took a step forward, his gun now raised and pointed squarely at Elon. The crowd gasped, the sound rippling through the air like a shockwave. A few parents shielded their children's eyes, while others whispered frantically to event staff, their voices filled with urgency. "Back off," the guard growled, his voice low and threatening. "I'm done listening." Elon didn't move. His gaze remained steady, his posture calm despite the weapon aimed at his chest. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice unwavering. Put the gun down and we'll figure this out. The guard's finger hovered near the trigger, his breathing heavy. His companion looked up from the device, his expression a mixture of panic and anger. "What are you waiting for?" he snapped. "He's stalling. Do something." But the guard hesitated, his resolve crumbling under the weight of the moment. The pressure was mounting, the cracks in their plan widening with every passing second. And Elon knew it. "Listen to me," Elon said, his tone softening. "Whatever brought you to this point, it doesn't have to end here. You can still make a different choice." The crouching man cursed under his breath, his frustration boiling over. He reached for the device, his hands moving quickly as he began connecting the final wires. "If you're not going to do it, I will," he muttered. Elon's eyes darted to the device, his mind racing. The seconds stretched, each one filled with the deafening thrum of his own heartbeat. He had to act, but every option felt like a gamble. One wrong move and the situation could spiral out of control. Behind him, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their unease palpable. Ethan stood near the barricade with his father, his small hands clutching the metal railing as he watched the scene unfold. His eyes were wide with fear, his chest tight as he struggled to breathe. He wanted to shout, to tell Elon to be careful, but his voice caught in his throat. And then, without warning, the man crouching near the device froze. His hands stopped moving, his eyes narrowing as he looked past Elon, toward the crowd. His lips curled into a sneer, and he let out a low, humorless laugh. "Looks like you've got an audience," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Hope they're ready for a show." Elon's gaze flicked toward the crowd, his heart sinking. The tension was reaching its breaking point, the situation teetering on the edge of chaos. But he couldn't back down. Not now, not when so much was at stake. The guard tightened his grip on the gun, his jaw clenching as he took another step forward. "Last chance," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "Get out of here, or I swear." But before he could finish, a sharp voice cut through the tension, commanding and unyielding. "Drop the weapon." The sharp voice reverberated through the tense air, slicing through the charged silence like a lightning strike. All eyes turned toward its source, a security officer, dressed in a dark tactical uniform, standing just beyond the barricades. He held his weapon steady, aimed directly at the guard who was still gripping his gun. Behind the officer, a small team of security personnel had assembled, their faces hard and focused as they fanned out across the perimeter. The guard froze, his body rigid as his gaze darted between the officer and Elon. His breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling in short, shallow bursts. His companion crouching by the device didn't move, his hands hovering over the tangle of wires as though he were weighing his next move. "Drop it," the officer commanded again, his voice firm. "Put the gun down and step away from the restricted area." For a moment, it seemed like the guard might comply. His grip on the gun loosened slightly, his hand trembling. But then his companion spoke, his voice low and sharp. "Don't," he muttered. "If we back down now, it's over. Everything we've worked for, it's gone." The guard's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening as he tightened his grip once more. His gaze flicked back to Elon, who stood motionless, his calm demeanor unshaken despite the weapon still pointed at him. "You don't understand," the guard said, his voice cracking. "This isn't about you. It's bigger than you. It's not bigger than the people you're putting at risk," Elon replied evenly. His voice was calm but carried an edge of urgency. "Think about what you're doing. Whatever cause you're fighting for, this isn't the way." The crouching man let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Spare us the speech," he snapped. "You think you're the hero here? You're just another suit who doesn't get it. You think you can talk your way out of everything. I think there's always a choice," Elon said, his gaze shifting between the two men. "And right now you have one. You can stop this before it's too late." The man by the device scoffed, his hands moving back to the wires. "We're already past that point." "No, you're not," Elon said, his voice firm. "But if you keep going, there's no coming back." The man hesitated, his hands pausing over the device. For a moment, Doubt flickered across his face, but it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. He shook his head, muttering under his breath as he worked faster, his movements growing more frantic. The security officer stepped closer, his weapon still trained on the guard. "This is your last warning," he said, his tone hardening. "Drop the weapon or we will use force." The guard's breathing grew heavier, his body tense as he stood on the edge of a decision. His companion glanced up at him, his expression hard. "Don't you dare," he hissed. "If you drop that gun, we're done." The crowd behind the barricade was deathly silent now, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Parents shielded their children, their faces pale with fear. Event staff stood frozen, their radios crackling faintly as they waited for instructions. Among them, Ethan clutched his father's hand tightly, his wide eyes locked on Elon. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could feel the gravity of it, the danger, the stakes. His chest tightened as he watched, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the murmurs around him. Elon took a step closer to the two men, his movements slow and deliberate. He raised his hands slightly, a gesture meant to diffuse the tension. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady. "This doesn't have to end badly. Put the gun down and we can talk." The guard's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Talk? You think talking's going to fix this?" "I think it's a better option than the one you're about to choose," Elon replied, "because that option ends with you losing everything." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. The guard faltered, his grip on the gun wavering as he struggled to process the moment. His companion, however, was less conflicted. With a sharp curse, he slammed his hand down on the device, connecting the final wire. A faint beep filled the air, sharp and rhythmic, as a small red light blinked to life on the device. The crowd gasped, the sound rippling through the tense silence. Even the security officers hesitated, their focus momentarily shifting to the device. "What did you do?" the guard hissed, his eyes widening as he turned to his companion. "Bought us some time," the man replied, his tone cold. "Now they'll have to listen." Elon's gaze shifted to the device, his mind racing as he calculated the possibilities. The blinking light was a warning, a signal that the timer had been activated. He didn't know how much time they had, but he knew it wasn't much. "Step away from the device," Elon said, his voice sharper now. "You're putting everyone here at risk." The crouching man smirked, his expression defiant. "That's the point." The security officer took another step forward, his weapon shifting slightly. "Both of you on the ground now." The guard's hand trembled, the weight of the situation finally breaking through his resolve. He lowered the gun slightly, his gaze darting between Elon, the officer, and his companion. "This wasn't the plan," he muttered, his voice shaking. His companion let out a harsh laugh. "Plans change," he said, his tone dismissive. "Now focus. We've got the upper hand." Elon stepped closer, his presence commanding. "You don't have the upper hand," he said. "What you have is a choice. End this now or live with the consequences." The guard hesitated, his grip on the gun loosening further. But his companion wasn't ready to back down. He reached for the device, his hand hovering over the timer as if daring anyone to stop him. The tension reached a breaking point, the air so thick it was hard to breathe. The crowd watched in silence, their fear palpable. And as the seconds ticked by, the situation teetered on the edge of chaos, with no clear way out. The blinking red light of the device pulsed steadily, a silent countdown that filled the air with dread. The crowd stood frozen behind the barricades, their collective fear palpable. Parents shielded their children's eyes, event staff whispered frantically into radios, and the security team remained on high alert, weapons drawn but unable to move closer without risking escalation. The entire scene felt suspended in a single moment, stretched taut and ready to snap. Elon Musk stepped forward again, his movements deliberate and his posture calm, but there was an unmistakable urgency in his eyes. He glanced at the device, taking in its makeshift design, the arrangement of wires, and the placement of the blinking timer. He didn't have the luxury of time to decipher every detail, but his sharp mind began working through the possibilities. If the men had wired the device correctly, even a minor disruption could trigger it. It was a precarious gamble, but it was one he couldn't avoid. I said, "Step back," the guard shouted, his voice breaking as his grip on the gun wavered. His fear was evident now, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of the situation. He was no longer in control, not of the device, not of his partner, and certainly not of himself. Elon ignored the warning, taking another step closer. "You've already lost control of this," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the guard's panic. "You don't want to admit it, but you know it's true. This ends one way, with you walking away before it's too late." The crouching man sneered, his hand hovering dangerously close to the timer. "You think you can talk us down?" he snapped. "You think we're scared of you?" "No," Elon replied, his tone steady, "but you're scared of what comes next. And you should be." The guard's breathing grew heavier, his hand trembling as the gun wavered in his grip. "Shut up," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He turned to his partner, desperation etched into his features. "What are we doing, man? This isn't what we talked about." The crouching man shot him a glare. "Don't lose it now," he hissed. "We're in too deep to back out." Elon seized the moment, his voice sharp and commanding. "You're not in too deep. Not yet. But if you keep going, there's no way out. You've already lost the crowd, and security is seconds away from shutting you down. You think this will make people listen? All it'll do is make them hate you." The crouching man's sneer faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He looked at the device, then back at the guard, as though silently calculating their options. "They don't hate us now," he muttered bitterly. "They already think we're nothing. They think you're desperate," Elon countered. "And right now you're proving them right. But you have a chance to prove them wrong. To show them that you're better than this." The guard's shoulders slumped slightly, his arm lowering as the weight of the gun seemed too much for him to hold. He looked at Elon, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and uncertainty. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Elon's gaze softened, though his focus remained sharp. "You stop. You take a step back and you put the gun down. Let's end this before anyone gets hurt." For a moment, it seemed like the guard might listen. His grip on the gun loosened further, and he took half a step back. But his companion wasn't ready to give up. He slammed his hand down on the device, his voice rising in anger. "No," he shouted. "We don't back down. Not now, not ever." The sharp beep of the timer grew louder, the red light blinking faster now. The crowd gasped, their fear spilling over into panicked murmurs. The security officers tensed, their weapons shifting as they prepared for the worst. Elon's heart raced, but he didn't move. He couldn't afford to show fear. Not now, not when the situation was on the verge of spinning out of control. Instead, he turned his full attention to the crouching man, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You've already lost," he said, his tone cold and unyielding. "Look around. The crowd isn't cheering for you. No one is listening. All they see is a desperate man clinging to a bad decision." The man froze, his hand hovering over the timer. His defiance faltered, replaced by a flicker of something else, shame. He glanced at the crowd, at the security officers, and finally at his partner, who now stood frozen, his gun hanging limply at his side. "You don't get it," the man muttered, his voice trembling. "This was supposed to be different. We were supposed to make them see." Elon's voice softened, though it remained firm. "And what do they see now? Two men risking everything for nothing. Is that how you want to be remembered?" The man's hand dropped, his body sagging as the weight of Elon's words sank in. He looked down at the device, the blinking red light reflecting in his eyes. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, it seemed like he might surrender. But then, in a desperate final act, he reached for the timer again, his movements frantic. "No," he shouted. "I won't let them win." Before he could touch the device, Elon moved. In a blur of motion, he stepped forward, his hand darting out to grab the man's wrist. The two struggled briefly, their movements chaotic as the device teetered on the edge of the platform. The security officers rushed forward, their shouts echoing through the air. The guard dropped his gun, his hands raised as he backed away, his face pale with fear. The crowd erupted into chaos, their panicked cries drowning out the rest of the noise. And then, with a final push, Elon forced the man's hand away from the timer, the device falling to the ground with a sharp clang. The crouching man slumped to the ground, his defiance gone, replaced by exhaustion and defeat. The red light blinked one last time before going dark. The crowd had finally begun to settle, though a nervous energy still lingered in the air. Security officers moved efficiently, securing the two men who had come so close to turning the day into a nightmare. Their earlier defiance had crumbled, replaced with exhaustion and the weight of their decisions. The taller man, the one who had been clutching the gun, sat slumped against a metal barricade, his head hanging low. His partner, still glowering but eerily silent, had stopped resisting altogether. Ethan watched the scene unfold with wide eyes, his small hands gripping the edge of his father's jacket. His father knelt beside him, whispering words of reassurance, but Ethan's attention remained fixed on Elon Musk. To the young boy, Elon no longer looked like the calm, collected figure he had seen in interviews or the hero who had defused the danger. For the first time, Ethan saw the weight Elon carried, the heaviness in his shoulders, the way his breath came slower now, like he had finally allowed himself to feel the enormity of what had just transpired. As the officers led the two men away, Elon stepped forward, his gaze falling on the crowd that had grown silent in his presence. The fear and confusion in their eyes spoke volumes, and he knew the event, one that was meant to inspire wonder and hope, had instead left a scar. The people needed reassurance, a reminder of why they were here in the first place. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had happened. What happened here today could have ended differently, he began, but it didn't. And that's because of all of you, because you stayed calm, because you trusted the people working to keep you safe. The crowd listened intently, their unease beginning to shift into something else. Hope, perhaps, or at least a sense of relief. Parents exchanged glances, children clung to their mothers' and fathers' hands, and the murmurs of fear faded into silence. Elon turned toward the rocket, its towering frame a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded beneath it. This rocket, he said, gesturing toward it, represents more than just technology. It represents the best of us, the drive to reach beyond what we know, to explore, to create, to learn. That doesn't change because of what happened today. If anything, it makes our mission more important. The crowd began to stir, a few nodding in agreement. The murmurs returned, but this time they carried a tone of understanding, of solidarity. Elon's words had cut through the fear, reminding them of the purpose that had brought them all together. Ethan's father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice soft. "See, Ethan? That's what real courage looks like." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was still watching Elon, who had turned his attention to the device now being carefully dismantled by security specialists. His mind buzzed with questions he didn't know how to put into words. Finally, he spoke, his voice small but firm. "Dad, do you think I could ever be like him?" His father knelt down, looking his son in the eye. "You already are," he said. "You were brave today. You trusted him. And you did the right thing." The words settled over Ethan like a warm blanket, and for the first time since the ordeal began, he felt his chest loosen. But his gaze still lingered on Elon, as though the man held all the answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask yet. Elon, meanwhile, had returned to the barricade, his sharp gaze sweeping over the scene one final time to ensure the situation was fully under control. The officers gave him a brief nod, silently confirming that the threat had been neutralized. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. As he turned to leave, he noticed Ethan standing near the barricade, his wide eyes locked on him. Something about the boy's expression stopped him in his tracks. He approached slowly, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. "You did good back there," Elon said, his tone softer now as he crouched to meet Ethan's gaze. "You stayed calm when things got scary. That's not easy." Ethan blinked, his small hands clutching his father's sleeve. "I didn't do anything," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Elon smiled faintly. "Sometimes doing nothing is the hardest thing of all. Staying calm when everyone else is panicking. That takes real strength." Ethan's father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said to Elon, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here." Elon nodded, accepting the thanks without fanfare. "I'm just glad everyone's safe," he said simply. Ethan hesitated for a moment before blurting out, "Do you think I could go to space someday?" The question caught Elon off guard, but his smile widened. "I think you've got what it takes," he said, his tone serious but encouraging. "Just remember, being an astronaut isn't about being fearless. It's about being brave enough to face your fears." Ethan nodded solemnly, the weight of the words settling over him. He didn't fully understand what they meant, but he knew they were important. Elon rose to his feet, his gaze shifting to the rocket one final time. The threat had been neutralized, but the day's events had left their mark. Still, he knew this moment could be salvaged, that it could serve as a reminder of resilience and the importance of unity in the face of adversity. As he turned to leave, the crowd parted for him, their murmurs filled with admiration and gratitude. He didn't linger, didn't bask in the attention. This wasn't about him, it never had been. It was about the boy with dreams of the stars, the parents who wanted a better future for their children, and the countless others who believed in the power of innovation to change the world. The rocket loomed in the background, a testament to humanity's determination to push beyond the boundaries of what was known. And as Elon walked away, the crowd began to cheer, not out of relief or celebration, but out of hope. Ethan watched him go, his small heart swelling with admiration. He didn't know if he'd ever see Elon Musk again, but he knew one thing for certain. Today had changed him. And as he looked up at the towering rocket, he whispered a promise to himself. Someday he would reach the stars. What you just witnessed was more than a story about danger and bravery. It's a lesson about resilience, responsibility, and the choices we make in critical moments. There's something deeply profound in how one decision can change the course of events. And that's what makes this story so powerful. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we can all take away from this. First, courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about facing fear head-on. Elon Musk didn't need to take a stand. He could have walked away, left it to security, or played it safe. But he didn't. He chose to stay. Why? Because sometimes doing the right thing means putting yourself in uncomfortable, even dangerous situations to protect others. This isn't just about being a billionaire or a public figure. It's about humanity, about the responsibility we all have to step up when it matters most. Now think about the young boy, Ethan. He started the day full of wonder, dreaming about rockets and space. But when faced with danger, he found himself in a moment that tested his trust and bravery. He may not have known it at the time, but simply staying calm and trusting the right people made all the difference. It reminds us that even small acts, choosing to listen, choosing to trust, can have an impact. And then there are the antagonists in this story. Their choices led them down a destructive path, but their actions serve as a warning. Anger and desperation, when left unchecked, can spiral into something dangerous. The two men thought their actions would make people listen, but in the end, they only hurt themselves. The lesson here is clear. There are always better ways to make your voice heard. Violence, threats, and chaos don't solve problems. They only create more. For all of us watching, the question isn't, what would Elon Musk do? It's, what would you do? Would you stay calm in the face of danger? Would you step up when others need you? Would you think about the consequences of your actions before making a decision? These moments define us, not just as individuals, but as a society. Finally, let's not forget the rocket, standing tall as a symbol of human ambition. It's a reminder of what we're capable of when we work together, when we aim higher, and when we dream big. Innovation like this doesn't just happen. It takes collaboration, courage, and a shared belief in a better future. So, ask yourself, what's your rocket? What goal are you working toward? And how are you handling the challenges along the way?